Sarah Smalley did a service with us called Question Box Sunday, and just set herself up for open questions, and it was very engaging and thoughtful and non threatening, or and we thought we'd try that here with Stephanie, who is now ordained and has all knowledge, great and small. Just kidding. So we'll just open it up to questions, and I have a couple reserved, ready to go if things start slow or whatever. But I'd like to open it up to other people first.
Can I just say from the start, Chuck, I'm going to ask you to keep an eye on time. I'm going to try to keep my responses brief because Lord knows I can ramble. But if you can keep an eye on the clock of like when we need to wrap up, that would be helpful.
Sure, I can do that. Anybody want to start? Well, I can ask the one I thought of. One of the two I thought.
think Andrea has a question, hon.
Oh, yes, Andrea.
And then you notice I do that really coy thing, like, oh no, it's not really a question, just touching my face. Yes, thanks. I just am having trouble getting the question out, so I was like, maybe this will give me another moment. Good morning, y'all. Nice to see you. Stephanie, congratulations on your ordination. The question that's really been sitting with me in advance of knowing about this service is, how do I invite God into spaces that we've never been taught that God might want to be present in, like conflict, criticism, our sexual lives. I can think of all sorts of spaces where we're taught, like, or at least as I step away from the spiritual training that I grew up with and into a conversation with God of my choosing, things you and I have talked about. How do I imagine God in some of these places that I've never thought to invite God in?
So I don't know if this is helpful, but the first thought for me is like, I don't have to invite God anywhere because God's already there for me. And so it's this very mystical idea of Rabbi Lawrence Kushner. I know I've talked about this. And he would say that, like, if God is some circle, we are actually inside of that. And the goal of spirituality is to experience the blurring of the line and realize that whatever is the animating force of the universe is everywhere and in all people and in all situations and inside of us. And our goal is to experience the blurring of that line. And so to me, it's very much connected to the, like, restoration of the world, Tikkun Olam story from Jewish mysticism. But I think there is a sense, at least in the Christianity that I grew up with, that has a lot of, Lutherans didn't necessarily have this, but Wheaton did, of evangelism, of bringing the gospel somewhere, of having to go enlighten people, right? Like take a candle into the darkness, as opposed to, for me now, it's like letting my eyes adjust. And it's like, oh, I can see even in this, even in how dark and dusky this place is. But so for me, I don't know if that's an answer, because I don't think there is an answer. But maybe even that mindset shift is helpful. Yes, no, maybe so. That it's more of a scavenger hunt about finding what's already there than bringing something into a place that it's never been. I hope that's...
Invitation, wanting to invite God in, is because I'm out of practice or out of comfort in imagining God everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Just speaking from my own experience,
Yeah.
That's still a huge stretch for me. And so
Yeah,
the spiritual journey I'm on right now is very much an act of trying to recognize God in places that I don't already.
Yeah.
I don't yet have the comfort of just God is here no matter what.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I believe that, but I don't experience it all the time for sure. And so I feel like the prayers that I say the most often are like, help me see, or help me see the world as you see the world. And that is built off of a belief that there's holiness already built into everything. But yeah, so then the mantra just becomes like, help me see the world as you see the world. Help me see you, help me, you know, like it's kind of that like stacking poem that we did if you were in that class. Yeah, all the phrases of that and however short or long that sentence is, all the words of that sentence have been really powerful sort of keys to unlock a different way of experiencing, a different way to walk through the world. Is that a little bit more helpful? Cool. And I don't know, and report back and tell us what you find. I think my favorite, I'm gonna go off on a mini tangent, like my favorite thing about my first ordination was how much it made me think about ordination, because I never thought that I would be ordained because I didn't want to be a congregational pastor, and here I am again. But I was like, I'm not holier or specialer than anyone else. I just am someone who is obsessed with this stuff and has been, you know, entrusted by the community to be obsessed with this stuff. And so just as you would ask a cardiologist questions about your heart and blood clots, because they've spent a lot of time being obsessed with it, like that's, I think that that's how I really see ordination is, you know, as much as my white coat ceremony of just saying like, you have agreed to be this person in the circle of our community, and other people are raisers of children, and other people are tenders of the land, and you are a tender of the spirit, you know. And so my perspective isn't any more like correct than anybody else's. It's just I've spent a lot of time reading and obsessing about it, and so I offer whatever is helpful, but that doesn't make it right. So I want to put that disclaimer out there. What else you got? You can ask me my favorite Brandy Carlisle song. No, don't get me started on her.
My question was kind of tied to that, and it has to do with one time I was hearing that biblical verse, and I don't know the chapter and verse, but about my Father's house has many rooms, and I thought, oh, how universalist sounding that is. And then right away it says, but only way into my Father's house is through me. I think this is what Jesus says, something like that. And I just wonder about what have you had an evolving thing from being a Lutheran pastor to now, as far as interpreting the exclusivity of that, the sound of that in Scripture, or did you always kind of feel like you had a more universalist attitude toward all of that?
Well, the Lutherans kicked me out because I was a universalist.
Yeah.
I didn't know it. They did. But we all made it around, and we're all in the right place now. But there are a couple short things that I will say about that. My biggest exclusivity rub was actually when I was at Wheaton. I started at Wheaton, which is a very conservative school outside of Chicago, where Billy Graham went and all that kind of stuff. Rob Bell actually went there too, which is interesting. So that was when exclusivity really like rubbed at me the first time. And some of the ways I've been able to sort of theologically work through that is that it's actually through a psychological model called spiral dynamics, which is transcend and include. And so at the time, we're very much as a society in a place there was like one leader that was the head of the cult, and often that leader was thought to be like divinely appointed, whether it was a pharaoh, whether it was a king, whether it was a whatever. And like we did this for thousands of years, right? And so a lot of the ways that Jesus talks about the movement that he was trying to start uses the language of the time. Even things like washed in the blood, like who washes anything in blood? That makes no sense. Well, it was basically like a fraternity cult ritual of the Greco-Roman times that you would stand in this pit and they'd slaughter a bull over you, and it was like, or whatever animal, and it was kind of this hazing, and you get drenched in the blood, and now you're a member of that particular fraternal order. And so Jesus is borrowing phrases from all of these people to try to connect with the way that the culture was at the time. Right? Where it's like, if Jesus were here now, I wonder if he'd be like, oh my gosh, I'm so living for that. Or like, I'm so here for that. Right? But like, he wasn't saying those things at the time. So I think he was very much speaking the language of the culture that he was in. That's how I get around a couple of those things. The two other things I want to say is, and I said this all the time as a Lutheran pastor, when I was allowed to be a Lutheran pastor, is I don't care if you believe in Jesus. I care if you believe in what Jesus believed in. And you've heard me say this before. Kindness, compassion, hope, generosity, justice, forgiveness, all that really difficult stuff, being there for each other through the shit. Pardon my French. I don't know if I'm allowed, well, whatever, you can fire me if you don't want me to swear. I don't have too many days left. So I don't talk a lot about Jesus, even when I was a Christian pastor, but I talk a lot, I hope, about what Jesus talked about. And so whether it was one-on-one with people in the hospital, chaplaincy, that's why chaplaincy was in some ways a better fit, is because I was like, I think the person of Jesus like lived a really good example and talked about really important things, and that's what I'm into. But I don't, because it's not how do I get from my little self circle to the big God circle and there's only one bridge. I'm like, we're all in the same circle, and I want to blur that boundary. I want to feel the unity that I think is already underlying all of this. And I think that being kind, I think that being generous, I think that being compassionate are ways to experience the blurring of that boundary, which is why I'm a Unitarian pastor and not a Lutheran one. The last thing I will say is how I have at this point, and I'm sure this will change, I hope this will change, but the interesting thing about my ordination, and I think this gets to the exclusivity of Jesus, a lot of my friends and family were totally unfamiliar with the UU tradition and still are. You know, my grandma sent me an email and she was like, I listened to your ordination service and I noticed that they didn't mention God anywhere. And I was like, you know, Grandma, I hadn't noticed that. So she's like, can you tell me? She was raised like old school Catholic, like had to break off her first engagement because the guy was Methodist instead of Catholic, you know, so she like has never really visited another church except for maybe like my baptism and ordination and stuff. So, so she's like, can you kind of tell me what they're about? So the way that I have to this point been explaining Unitarian Universalism to people is most churches sort of gather around this statement of beliefs, which feels like this dotted line that you have to sign on. Literally, to apply to Wheaton, I had to sign a statement of belief. And I just closed my eyes and held my nose because I didn't agree with half the things in there, but I want to go to school. So there's literally a line that you sign, this is what we believe. And I was like, Unitarians think that that's a box with an open lid that's going to constantly be rifled through, and the beliefs are going to change all the time. And I think they should be changing all the time. This isn't something porcelain that gets set on a shelf. This is like working material, and you toss old things out and you bring new things in. But what Unitarians gather around instead of the dotted line is a rigorous search for truth and meaning, right? This is our principles and sources of how are you getting information from good places? Are you inspired by the holy teachings of all kinds of wisdom traditions? The earth, like, you know, there are a million places that we can get bad inspiration that we fill our box with and source our box with. And then how does that show up in your life? Does it make you a person that acts the way that Jesus acted, right? So rather than saying Jesus is the key that goes in the box and you better have the right thing in your box, it's like, it's coming from someplace legit, and it's making you show up in the world in a way that matters. And there are a lot of people for whom the exclusivity of Jesus is what's on their dotted line. And then they're spreading a lot of hate, a lot of greed, a lot of envy, a lot of all that stuff. And I'm like, that does not look like the fruit off of the tree that was Jesus to me. So I'm not too picky about what goes in your belief box. And so the way I talk about Unitarians is we're really united about rigorous search for truth and meaning, and then like very engaged presence in the world of how those beliefs make a difference in your life. And I think a lot of people come to UUism, in my experience, because they felt confined by the belief box of other places, and they're like, oh, this is comfortable. But they stayed because there was that constant challenge of not staying comfortable, but yeah, what else could I be learning from, and how else can that impact how I show up in the world? So yeah, to me, that gets to the exclusivity of Christianity, and where I don't totally get into it. And I'm like, you can get nitpicky about the only way is through me, or if we said like the only way is to follow the example of the kind of life I've led, is so much more interesting to me. And that's the second half of like, do your beliefs make you, you know, for lack of a better word, a pro-social person? Are you generous? Are you kind? Are you fighting for justice? Are you looking out for the weak and the poor, and, you know, all that stuff? Interesting, helpful, something.
Yeah. I've often wondered if the word only is in there because he was saying, I'm the only one around here in these times that is saying this stuff.
Sure.
You know?
And it's been a while since I read the Greek. Yeah. The other thing that comes to mind is like, we don't actually know what Jesus said. We know what some people heard him say that got written down 30, 50, and 100 years later. And each of them very much had their own agenda about it. And so I'm like any communication, there is, there's a goal. You know, communication is always a tool. And so there was a goal. And so, yes, Jesus over and over and over talks about being the only way to the Father, which we're not really into either. The Trinity-ness of it. So I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I'll become worm food and Jesus will be like, you know, you didn't like pray that prayer at the Baptist altar. And so
Yeah.
swipe left. And I'll be like, all right, well, if it's those people that are in there, I don't want to spend eternity with them anyways.
Right.
Send me the other way.
Yeah. I have
I don't know.
a question about that the Bible has been translated. I'm assuming it's the Greek from the New Testament has been translated into a number of different Bibles. I'm just kind of curious if you have, you know, because I have never compared them or studied them or anything. I mean, I was raised with King James, and I'm just kind of curious what
So
educated.
Yeah. Fun fact about the King James is that he commissioned that translation of the Bible so that the church would let him, I think, get divorced or have a mistress, but there was some sort of thing like, can I do this thing that I want if I pay for you to get a new fancy Bible? So Bible translation 101 is there's thought for thought translations and there's word for word translations. And then there's everything on the spectrum. So like, I'm trying to think of the verse. There's like a verse in Proverbs that's like, an honest word is a kiss on the lips, would be like a word for word translation. And then it's like an honest reply is a sign of true friendship, would be the thought for thought translation. And so it's the same words in the Hebrew of the Old Testament, but one like literally says a kiss on the lips, but culturally that was a sign of true friendship. Somebody that you knew really well, you would share that kiss. And so a more thought for thought, which is like NIV is going to be more like on that spectrum. NRSV is like somewhere more on the thought for thought. The Message is the best example of like super thought for thought. Like we're not trying to word for word this, but it's like, this is what they were saying and trying to do a little bit of the cultural translation. Whereas like a King James, something like that is going to be way more like a kiss on the lips instead of, okay, well, what they meant was like a sign of true friendship. I don't remember the first half of that proverb, I'm sorry. But I used to work at a Christian bookstore in high school. And so I had this conversation a lot. So that's kind of one way to parse out Bible translations that I think is important to realize as kind of the major difference from them. And I used to be able, when I worked at the bookstore, read Bibles, I could sort of put them all on a line of from here to here, where they were. And that's why people keep coming out with new ones. And that's why my scholarship when I was in divinity school the first time was trying to immerse myself enough in the Greek literature of the time so that I understood the cultural context of what was going on, so that I knew that the washed in the blood thing was like a fraternal cult ritual, or I had read the poems that Paul was plagiarizing to put into the letters, stuff like that. So it was kind of like, how would the original ear, what echoes would the original ears have heard with this, So yeah, that was something that was interesting to me when we look at sacred text.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find it interesting. I listened to one course on the Old Testament where the professor went through and basically said, well, if you highlight the Old Testament, 50% of it, we can kind of figure out its source is from this particular prior document or that document, right? And then he said, all the rest is a smattering of stuff that you could say, some of it was 30, 40, 100 years before Jesus was around and has been filtering through. And you got to remember that it was a committee of a bunch of white guys sitting around saying, hey, what should go in here? Do we want this? There was a lot of give and take to actually come up with, and it was, I want to say, you can correct me if you know better, but it was like somewhere between 100 and almost 200 years after Jesus' death before the first written parts were starting to come together.
So the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament have sort of different stories in terms of how they were codified into one book. The Christian New Testament, yeah, it was a while before they, because John, the Gospel of John, let me give you my quick little spiel on the Christian Gospels because they're all so different. So Mark is like the AP news report, like comes out like really quickly, all things considered, after Jesus's murder. And so like short sentences, really quick to the point, sort of ends on a cliffhanger. This is like just the facts, really urgent, really important. Matthew and Luke take another 20 years, use Mark's gospel, sort of use some materials with each other. Matthew is talking to Jewish people, and so that's why he has like Born Under the Star of David, all of this stuff, all of the stories in Matthew are very much geared towards a Jewish audience, talking about all these fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. Luke doesn't care. Luke has none of that stuff because he's like, whatever, that's not the people I'm talking to. So Matthew is very Jewish. Luke, and they have a little bit of time. They're like, we still need to like strike while the iron's hot and this is a relevant conversation, but like I want to make sure that we're gearing really towards an audience. Luke is very much like the left out, the low down, widow, orphan, poor, all of that stuff for the least of these. So he's going to have all of those stories of like the foot washing and stuff like that. So he has the shepherds come in Luke, but who comes in Matthew is the wise men, right? He's like kings and rulers from the official place. This is a king. This is the king that we were waiting for from the Hebrew Bible. Luke is like, these lowly nobody kids crawled out of the woods and they were included. Isn't that great? You can be too. So that's Luke and Matthew. Then the Gospel of John is like, so those are kind of biographies. The Gospel of John is like Hamilton. Took him 100 years after Jesus died. Very artistic, very stylized, uses the facts, but like, that's when I was like, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all of this like fluffy oratory stuff, because he was really talking to the philosophers, the academics, the Greeks, the poets, and so he was using words that they knew, and he had a lot more time to like play with it. I feel like the Jesus that shows up in John, like just kind of glows and is always like hovering like 2 inches off the ground, like that kind of guy, you know? And so those 4 gospels arrive very differently. Then after that, somewhere in all there, Paul's writing a bunch of letters, plagiarizing a bunch of things, blah, blah, blah. They're sending stuff around. So it's a couple hundred years after that that they have the first council about what's going to go into the Bible and what isn't, what gets left out, what goes into the Gnostic Gospels, what becomes like pericope letters, what stories get cut out. So there are some stories that are called floating stories. So like the woman at the well, or not the woman at the well, the woman caught in adultery, like she was doing it by herself. The woman who's caught in adultery, the man who has no consequences, she gets dragged out. This is the famous story, right? Of like, he who's without sin, because it's all these dudes around, like, look what she was doing. And he says, cast the first stone. So Jesus does not condemn the woman. He doesn't say anything about sex that they like want him to be like, you horrible woman, right? Doesn't say any of that. That story, which is one of the few times that Jesus even gets confronted by sex that we have, gets snipped out of John and kind of shoehorned in different places and also like disappears in certain versions. And so to me, the editing process of the Bible is very revelatory in terms of the agenda that the committee had in terms of like, we don't want this story. Oh, it gets snuck in here this time because somebody keeps putting it back in, and then they're like, no, we don't want it. So it disappears somewhere else. So there was a long process about what is considered now the canon of the New Testament gets formed. Does that help, Flo? Slippery beast. The Hebrew Bible has a little bit more, a little bit longer history and a little bit more consistency because the rabbis like just work that dough, just keep turning it over and turning it over and turning it over. So there's like the midrash and the writings about the writings and then the writings about those writings. And so they have this really different sense of, there's the canon, but then there's like all of the commentaries on it are just as sacred, which I think is really beautiful. And the Christian traditions, I haven't encountered a Christian tradition that has the same sort of level of respect for almost being able to expand the canon in that way, the midrash and all that stuff.
What I just find interesting is that the very right side or whatever, here's the book, this is what it says, but they have no other than, well, I was told it was written by the hand of God,
right?
Therefore it's
super
all true.
I love the churches who are like, well, we're just Bible based. We just read the Bible. And I was like, oh, don't we all? But like,
yeah, but you got to know where.
Are you wearing polyester? Are you like, did you murder your son in the backyard for disobeying you? Because all that's in the Bible.
Right.
Do you have slaves? Yeah. That's in the Bible. Like, you can't read sacred text without interpretation. You absolutely cannot do it. And so anybody that says like, we just believe the Bible is tough for me to have a conversation with. Because I'm like, if you aren't acknowledging that you're making interpretations, then I don't know how to talk to you about what interpretations you're making.
Yeah.
So
and that's where I kind of come. It's like you need to know the sources of what you're
right
and the traditions.
Years and years learning all the things I just talked to you about of like, here's some, and then there are some people that are like, well, it's a sacred text, it's living, and I'm like, great. The stuff that I just shared might not be at all interesting to you, and still you encounter this text for the first time, like what it's saying to you is just as valid and just as in need of interpretation, So.
Well, Stephanie, I've always been bothered by the exclusion of what they call the Rosewood Scrolls that were found hundreds of years later in either Iraq or Iran up in the caves in the mountains, and they were all from the same time of have you ever heard of those scrolls?
It was a very common practice to bury sacred texts because there was so much like war and fighting and theft that's how the Dead Sea Scrolls were preserved as well, like sort of rolled up, soaked in oil, buried underground. And then these communities were often like driven from their land during conflict and then wouldn't be able to get back or wouldn't be able to find them or wouldn't have been able to tell anybody that that's where they were. So yeah, there's all kind, who even knows what we don't know? But no, I haven't heard of those in particular.
From what I remember from the documentary was that they were very inaccessible. It was very difficult to get up to these caves, so they probably didn't want to be them discovered, and they were more
Good job of protecting them.
Yeah,
They kept them safe. You know,
Yeah.
they did
Yep.
part of their job.
they ferreted them away so they wouldn't be found, and they were way more liberal,
Mm.
way more, say, not more patriarchal, because not all of his followers were men.
Oh, absolutely not. No, and in the Christian canon, they acknowledge that there was sort of about 30 women that went ahead and behind kind of the advanced team to like find the places to stay, cook. Like Jesus isn't cooking dinner, you know. So there is sort of this gaggle of women, and they are mentioned like looking on at the crucifixion, and so there is sort of an unnamed group of women that follow with the disciples and Jesus, sort of going ahead and going behind. And you know, imagine that, women throughout history cleaning up. And
I think we have time for one or two more,
Yeah.
and that's about it.
Great. What else you got, team? It doesn't have to be Christian, because I'm not really, but I did study a lot of that stuff. So if it's a helpful interpretive link.
I just have a comment when you're talking about the Bible, books of the Bible. I worked with a young man who is extremely religious, and occasionally we would talk about it. And he had decided that he only believed things in the New Testament, and he basically threw away the Old Testament. So I thought that was just an interesting decision.
Yeah. In our last couple of minutes, can I tell you the secret of chaplaincy? Did I already tell you this?
No.
Nothing. I just was, Holly's concern reminded me of this today. And when I was a chaplain, I spent so much time like trying to read the patient's chart and figure out how to talk to them about this gnarly thing or that. And I was like, well, this woman clearly wants to talk about how she's dying of cancer, and she's like worried about who's feeding her cats while she's in the hospital, you know? And so I was just like always wrong. And so secret of chaplaincy, the secret of friendship, you talk to anybody, you could say this to a stranger in a coffee shop, and you say, I understand you've been going through a lot lately. And you leave it. It's not a question that makes them answer. It's not being like, that cancer really sucks, doesn't it? Right? Like, it's not telling them how they feel. It's saying, I understand you've been going through a lot lately. And then sitting with them until they like, and just sitting really attentively until they're like, yeah, I'm so worried about who's feeding my cats. Or like, I'm really worried about whatever it is. And it's just been such a, when I don't know what to say, and like, if there was anything good to say in those moments, we would have figured it out by now, and there's nothing good to say, right? A lot of listening, a lot of presence, but giving the other person the space, letting them sort of lead the conversation, but showing up like, you know, this is hard and I'm here for you. So, and then the second half of the secret of chaplaincy is whatever they say to say, of course you're worried about who's feeding your cats. Of course you're worried about, like, how could you not be, you know, to be just like super validating. And I told some of my friends this, and they're like, you've done that to me. And my sister's like, sometimes when I say something like that, she tells me I'm worried. She's like, don't tell me, of course I'm allowed to be worried about it. And I'm like, all right, well, I don't have a lot of other tricks up my sleeve. That's the secret of pastoral care, is just being like, how could you not be worried about that? That is really tough. You're right. So that's pastoral care 101. I understand you've been going through a lot lately. Of course you're worried, upset, concerned, sad, frightened, you know.
Can I pose the final question? So how do you see it in a few months or a couple of years or whatever, your pastor persona and your chiropractic coming together and being
Yeah. So this is an MSc question, but I still have my answer. For me as an identity, they aren't separate, but as a way to like professionally show up in the world, our culture has separated them. So I'm not planning to open like a healing arts center where I like pray over people before I do their adjustments. Like that's not, there are definitely Christian chiropractic offices and those are great. That's not what I'm doing. I much more see it as like a way that I walk through the world. And so as I'm moving to Grand Marais, of like being someone that can do weddings and funerals and grief counseling and teaching and still preaching with you all and preaching at first a little bit over the summer. And so sort of staying as a like substitute preacher and being on the bench in Grand Marais, because it is a smaller community and the pastors, we all kind of know each other. So being supportive in that way. And then continuing to do the healing work that I do with bodies. And for me, bodies are kind of like the essence of what I think is magical in the world. And I just think bodies are geniuses, and the power of like bodies always trying to heal themselves is incredible to me. And so my physical practice is a very spiritual one for me. And I am learning techniques and styles of chiropractic that use a lot more energy, or like spirituality isn't the right word, but just more subtle ways of knowing, and are sort of not exclusively mechanical. And so that's been a really fun way to bring those a little closer. To me, it's like, I don't know how to set like their legs off the same person. I'm like, I don't know how to separate the body work I do from the spirituality that I do. And I had to go to different schools, and I had to get different certifications, and I had to pay different tuition, and I had to have different ceremonies. And so I'm like, the world sees them as separate, and that's fine. And I'm not going to try to make other people mush them together. But for me, they can't be separated. But I'm not starting a church, and I'm not starting like a UU chiropractic clinic or anything like that. So, and I have no idea. That's the whole fun is I have no idea. I have no idea how these are going to come together. I just know that both of these things are like inescapable callings that have like hunted me down. It feels like I'm like, I can't run away from, even if I tried. And I tried on this one. I really tried, and I couldn't run. So I don't know. I don't know yet. And I'm excited to see.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for opening yourself up to these questions and being thoughtful, and I think it was good.
My pleasure.
I have a closing benediction, if I can share that.
Beautiful.
It's a classic from Theodore Parker. Be ours a religion like sunshine goes everywhere. Its temple, all space. Its shrine, the good heart. Its creed, all truth. Its ritual, works of love. Its profession of faith, divine living. Thank you all, and you're invited to continue to stay on and join us for our coffee chat hour. And thank you again, Stephanie.
Yeah, my pleasure.